Greetings, everybody. Glad to see you here. I've been giving this lecture in this lecture series for probably about 10 years now, and as Professor Woe was saying, I don't think it's ever been more urgent given the geopolitical situation, which I think is probably the worst in my lifetime, and that is saying a lot. That's a long lifetime. But we have a situation where people in minority groups, women whom the president-elect objectifies, ordinary workers whom he will certainly betray, and former Bernie supporters have voted for the president-elect in large enough numbers that the standard kind of election shenanigans, not to say election fraud, were enough to put him in power, put him over the top. And so my first thought on finding out on the morning of November 9th, I was actually in Washington, D.C. at the time when my hostess told me what happened. My first thought was, what were they thinking? And then I realized that that was the wrong question. I remembered an event so about 7 or 8 years ago now, hello Tim, when a number of people who were quite concerned about violence in the mass media were speaking to the head of one of the big major networks. That's right, it was the head of a major network. And so I think this may have been in front of a congressional committee, and they asked him, what was the thinking process that went into the selection of your films this year? And he got rather irate, and he said there was no thinking process whatsoever. So what are people doing then instead if they're not thinking? Well, one of the groups of people who has understood all along what's happening in this election is the Italians, because they have gone through this with, I'm not referring at the moment to Mussolini, but to Premier Berlusconi, who was in power for almost 12 years and was a very similar kind of person, and a very similar kind of thing happened to get him into power. He said that the press focused only on personal attacks, the effect of which was to increase Mr. Berlusconi's popularity. His secret was an ability to set off a Pavlovian reaction among the leftist opponents, which engendered instantaneous sympathy in most moderate writers. And he goes on to say, Mr. Trump is no different. So the news media were so intent on ridiculing Mr. Trump's behavior that it ended up providing him with free advertising. Well, what I'd like to do with you in the brief time we have together is to try to understand this process a little bit better, and then I think I have some suggestions what we can do to fix it. Not in the short term, not directly, but over the long term, indirectly, to get us out of this situation. So one Republican who bolted the party when it looked like the president-elect was going to get the nomination, said, this man is not only a terrible candidate, but it is an indictment of our character. So I stopped to think about that, and I think I came up with something a little less violent, but more accurate, and that is, it's not exactly an indictment of our character. Americans have the same character that most other people have. That all other people have. It's an indictment of our culture. And then sure enough, Thomas Friedman said that this thing has much less to do with trade or income gaps and much more to do with culture and many Americans' feeling of homelessness. So that homelessness is an important element. It should remind us that Alvin Toffler, who was a futurist, who wrote a book called Future Shock, I wonder what he would call his present book now, Present Shock. He said that the advancement of materialist science, I'm not quoting him exactly yet, is that it has made us feel homeless in the universe. In other words, we do not recognize ourselves in the inert, sterile, meaningless, material picture of the universe. And that has led to serious feeling of disconnection among many, many people. Another commentator recently said that there's a lot of people who are suffering from, quote, depression nowadays, quote unquote, and psychiatrists are treating them and so forth, but it's actually a misdiagnosis. It's not depression, it's demoralization. It's just a feeling that we don't fit in, we're not in charge of our destiny, and so forth. So this comment on culture was interesting to me because I remembered a couple of comments that Mahatma Gandhi made way back in 1925. He said, "The political domination of England is bad enough. The cultural domination is infinitely worse. When the cultural domination is complete, the political will defy resistance. There will be no way that you can get rid of it." Speaking of getting rid of things. Yeah. So this is just to kind of give you our website and give you a sense of how to get in touch with us. The Metta Center is located way down south in Petaluma. And he also said to his own people, "I would ask you to forget the political aspect of the program namely getting rid of untouchability." He said, "I would ask you to forget the political aspect. There are political consequences of the struggle, but you are not to concern yourself with them," he said. "If you do, you will miss the whole result and also the political consequences." And that, I think, is exactly our situation. There's a lot we can say about the political maneuvering that led to this election, it's not quite an election yet. You know, one of the electors from Texas quit. He left his job as an elector, he said, to save his conscience, and he's very happy that he didn't cave in. "I will go and sleep peacefully at night," he said, "and mourn the loss of our republic." So I believe that it's a cultural shift that's been happening over a long period of time. Before I get into that, I just wanted to show you a picture of some of the books that the Metta Center has available, all of which are right here on the stage. This first one, I'm doing this now because I'm going to get very excited and forget to do it later. So let's look at it just now as a brief interruption. The first one, The Search for a Nonviolent Future, is really considered kind of a classic in what nonviolence is and how it works. It's a bit of an oldie but goodie. It's about 15 years old now. The middle one, The Nonviolence Handbook, is much more condensed, and it gives you practical information about how to succeed in nonviolent work, nonviolent movements in today's world. I'm happy to say that the Nonviolence Handbook has recently been translated into Chinese. And also been translated into Arabic. And I learned not long ago that there was a very big demonstration in Baghdad, which fortunately remained nonviolent because it could have been extremely devastating if it did not. And I learned later that all the leaders of that movement had read the Arabic translation of this book. So it is out there, and 12 copies as of today are on their way out to Standing Rock. So it is doing some good. Now, it is coming up on Christmas time, the biggest commercial holiday of the year. And you all probably have nieces and nephews, right? And you need to get Christmas presents for them. This is a wonderful book, Gandhi Searches for Truth. It's for children. It's called A Practical Biography for Children. The author is right here in this audience, and she may be willing to sign it for you. And they, as I say, they are up here on the stage. Okay, so I want to now take a look at our culture and what is forming it. What you see here is illustration of an experiment in what's called priming. by psychologists. What they did was took very young children, I'm talking 18 months old, and had them look at one of these four scenes, A, B, C, and D. As you can see, the two little figures, and they're just dolls, you know. The two little figures are being very friendly in A. In B, the person is alone. C, it's not human at all. And in D, they're looking away from one another. So they show them these pictures, and then a couple of minutes later, an investigator comes in and pretends, watch out for psychologists, by the way. They're doing this all the time. The investigator pretends to drop a tray full of pencils on the floor. Another investigator is hiding behind a one-way glass window, recording how many of the children jump up to help you put the pencils back in the box. And it may not surprise you to learn that the children who had seen A, where the two little dolls are being nice, were much more willing and ready and able to go and help the investigator. So they call this priming. Now I want to tell you about one other priming experiment, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about priming experiments. So the other experiment was done by two women at Princeton, Mary Wheeler and Susan Fisk. And the background for the experiment is this. If you are sitting in front of a monitor and a face is flashed on that monitor, and let's say the face is from a different race than you are, the MR, and they have this functional magnetic resonance imagery equipment hooked up to your brain, they can tell what parts of your brain are activated by what you've seen. And the standard reaction is for an area in the midbrain called the limbic system, and in particular the amygdaloid nucleus, or the amygdala, to fire up. And that's bad news, because that is the fight or flight center. So there is, however we acquired it, a deep response against persons that seem to us to be from a different race. Now, these two women didn't like that, as I would imagine you and I don't like it very much either. And they said, there's got to be a way around this. And they did something very simple, which is rare in science these days, and absolutely brilliant. And that is, before they flashed the face, they said, we want you to say whether this person likes coffee or tea. Or it might be, tell us whether this person likes crunchy peanut butter or smooth peanut butter. Of course, you have no idea. But the fact is, it completely suppressed that fight and flight response in the limbic system. And the reason is not far to seek. It suppressed it because you were then thinking of that person as a human being, as an individual, and not as a member of a category, not as a stereotype. And so your fight or flight reaction was not produced. So I now want to take you on a brief and rather unpleasant tour through American popular culture. I'm sorry if this will be the bad part of the lecture. You know, the bad professor, good professor. Good professor will be back on in about 15 minutes. But just almost at random, picking some advertisements, this is what extraordinarily love looks like. Hope you can afford extraordinary love for your partner. This ad shows a kind of sexy dude in a very sexy sports car. And the squiggles on the top, if you can't read that, the top is the driver's heartbeat, and the bottom is the engine RPM. And you see that they are identical, and they finally sum up to one wave. And there's actually a statement that you can't quite read in white, but on the right-hand side below the phony EKG, and it says, don't just don't just drive the car, be the car. I'm going to tell you why I'm traipsing you through all of this in just a minute. This is a guy at a cocktail party, has this enormous sign hanging around his neck saying, me, and he's introducing himself and saying, I'm in advertising. This one is right about just a couple of miles past our office in Petaluma. I don't know where they got the nerve to do this so close to the Metta Center, but it's a real estate ad, and on the top in bold letters it says, "Our pain is your gain." So let me stop here just for a second. So what this is telling you is that we live in a world of separateness, which we are so radically separate from one another that it is possible for another person to suffer for your benefit, and that you should be happy about that. They are really advertising the fact that you're making them suffer because their suffering measures your success, your achievement. This ad, of course, speaks for itself, and this one may put you in mind of a famous statement that Martin Luther King said, which was, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented civilization to a person-oriented civilization." So these advertisements have steadily, over a number of years, made us not just more oriented towards things, but actually to believe that we ourselves are things. And that makes violence very easy. Now, there are two works that I'd really like to recommend to you if you want to follow what has happened to our culture and you don't have time to read a lot. There's a book by Neil Postman called "Amusing Ourselves to Death," and he documents very, very effectively how the news media degenerated into an entertainment form where you're looking for scandals. And the other is a set of films. It's a 6-part documentary that was put out by the BBC, and it's called "Century of the Self." And that tells you how advertising was born and how there were kind of two groups that seized onto the possibilities to manipulate people through advertising. One of them was, of course, business, but the other was the German Nazi Party. This is how they developed propaganda, was ironically learning it from Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edmund Bernays, that people have deep underlying impulses and you can trigger them with certain images and hook them up to the desire to buy a certain product. So what advertising has done over the years has basically degenerated our concept of truth. I mean, when is the last time you heard an ad for a product in which a person said, "Well, our product is pretty good, you know, you might be able to find better and cheaper on the market, but, you know, we kind of like it if you buy our stuff." They always say, "This is the very best," without telling you what it's better than, so it's a meaningless statement, but it's not meant to have a meaning, it's meant to trigger your reaction. And they'll often go on to say, "Scientific studies prove this is guaranteed to help dental caries more than something." And you know perfectly well when you're listening to that advertisement, there were no scientific studies. This is just complete malarkey. I'm trying to think of a safe word to say in mixed company. It's just completely fabricated. There was no scientific study. And the people telling you that there was one don't care. They don't care that you know that they're lying, because what they're doing is reaching into your preconscious and triggering something. So we have people have been kind of set up by these commercial messages to not feel any sense of truth anymore. So when the news media exposes the fact that a presidential candidate is lying, it has absolutely no negative effect on the population. Now you might think, okay, so this is just a stray ad, you know, you watch as you go by. But people have studied the amount of exposure that we have to commercial messages and have come up with, there's two different studies. One said 2,000 and another one said 5,000 times a day. And so let's say if you take an average of 3,000 times a day, and if you say that you're 50 years old, because that's about the age when people start voting for Donald Trump, about age 50. you will have been exposed. Now, just do the math. I couldn't do the math. I got the computer to do it for me. You will be exposed to 54,750,000 commercial messages, at the end of which time your sense of truth will be pulverized. People can tell you anything. So that's one part of the story. This is kind of a 1-2 punch. The other two, of course, is the outright violence. And these are just a couple of film posters spotted almost at random in my walks down Telegraph Avenue when I was teaching at Berkeley. Very, very demoralizing messages. Real ain't pretty, and truth hurts. Well, this is an entirely different message. This is a statement that was made by G.K. Chesterton, and I think it's kind of very California. I'm kind of sorry that it was thumbtacked to a guitar. That hurt me a little bit, but it's on the back fence of a friend of mine in the town of Tamaulipas. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience, meaning that we are body, mind, and spirit, where the world of advertising is telling us basically we are body, body, and body. There's nothing that we can do about it. The influences are determining us, and that has led to an extremely negative picture of the world. Now, there's another aspect that I think I can bring in here, another kind of insight that I gained by being a professor of classics at Berkeley. This is the education that my parents paid for, so I might as well get some use out of it. And in the course of teaching classics, I specialized to a great extent in mythology. And I can tell you that Mr. Trump is deliberately, not consciously, I'm sure he wouldn't be able to articulate this, but on some gut level, he knows that he's being a type of figure which will have a galvanizing effect on the kind of people that we've been reduced to by advertising and the violence in the media. And that is, he is known as a trickster hero. Trickster hero gets away with stuff. The Greeks even had a word for it. You may not have heard that expression. It used to be a very common expression. The Greeks had a word for it. Well, they did. They identified the characteristic of this type of hero, and they called it poneria. Now, ponos in Greek means trouble, and poneria means troublemaking. So every time the newspaper said, this guy is a lot of trouble, his popularity went up because they were projecting him against that frame of a culture hero. There's another aspect to it that you can get from mythology. I was a specialist in the poet Homer and in oral poetry. And Homer, who composed, I mean, we consider that he probably composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, enormous body of poetry. He never repeated more than a single line. That's oral poetry gives you this flexibility to be innovating all the time. So it's rare to find a single line, more than a single line repeated. But there's one kind of type scene which takes 3 lines to deliver, and Homer uses it 4 times. And what this basically says is one character says to a bunch of his colleagues, it's a hero, a fighter saying to other fighters, I am in charge here because I can control the women. And for example, when Telemachus wants to take control back of the house that he's inherited from his father, he says this to the suitors. Everybody pay attention to me. I'm giving the orders around here now because I can control the women. And then he tells his mother to go back upstairs, and she does it. So again, every time it's exposed to view that this particular candidate was a misogynist, he goes up in prestige in the minds of a certain set of people. So not knowing this, because very few people, relatively speaking, took my mythology course at Berkeley, compared to the rest of the voting public, not knowing this, people were completely fooled by the outcome. So the question now is, what can we do about this? We've created a culture of untruth and violence, and it's still being pumped out massively by the mass media. What can we do to reverse that situation, to rescue ourselves? Well, the minute I say untruth and violence, it should make you think of the opposite, which is truth and nonviolence. And truth and nonviolence sounds like Gandhi. That's what he was always about. And sure enough, this is good, Professor, now. You can relax. Sure enough, nonviolence has been growing and expanding very impressively in the modern world. Last April at the Vatican, there was an important meeting called by, under the direction of one of Pope Francis's cardinals, to discuss the validity of the just war theory. Now, the just war theory was 1,200 years old and had never been seriously considered before this time. And it turned out that the impulse to do this came from a movement which was called the Just Peace movement. Instead of a just war, let's have a just peace. And there were people in the nonviolence community promoting this from the 1980s onward. In fact, one of my friends, a Jesuit priest, said, the Vatican has not discussed nonviolence. This is the first time since the Sermon on the Mount. So that is a very big breakthrough. Another big breakthrough was at the UN, where friends of mine have been working for 12 years to get this to happen. There was a major meeting about UN peacekeeping, blue helmets, and what they were talking about at this particular meeting, and it's on the UN website, you can find the film, I can send you the link, was a brand new institution since Gandhi and King. Though Gandhi had it as a notion, he called it Shanti Sena or Peace Army, but there are now 12 organizations going around the world practicing what is called UCP, or Unarmed Civilian Peacekeeping, or it's sometimes interpreted as Unarmed Civilian Protection. And so for the first time ever, the United Nations is seriously considering using unarmed, nonviolence-trained protectors. And at this UN meeting, which is really quite thrilling, they showed a 3-minute documentary that one of these groups, Nonviolent Peace Force, had prepared for them. And they told a story. I already knew this story because I had interviewed one of these people. 2 people from their organization, which is called Nonviolent Peace Force, were at a UN IDP camp in South Sudan. So you know that South Sudan has had an absolutely bloodthirsty civil war going on for a long time. And IDP means an internally displaced person. There are something like 10 million IDPs in South Sudan, and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. So they're in this UN camp, and this camp holds people of one of the 2 main ethnic groups in Sudan. So they're either Dinka or Nuer, and suddenly a militia from the other group burst into the camp, and the United Nations soldiers are under orders not to fire, so they could do nothing. And these 2 fellows who were there from Nonviolent Peace Force ran for protection like everybody else, and then they remembered you can't outrun a bullet, and they ducked into a little house. In that house, they found 4 women and 9 children huddling in terror. So they stayed with them, tried to comfort them, and sure enough, a few minutes later, the militia burst in. They were startled to find these guys. One was from the UK, one was from South America. Derek Oakley and Andres Gutierrez found them and ordered them out, knowing that these 2 fellows knew full well that the minute they stepped out of that hut, the women and children would be massacred. So what they did, very calmly, they glanced at each other, got stabilized a little bit like we're going to have in our exercise after this talk, and took out their badges and calmly said, "I'm sorry, we're international protection officers and we're not leaving." And after a stunned silence, the militia left. Not only that, that happened 3 times. This attack lasted for 20 minutes, in which 60 people were massacred. But where the unarmed peacekeepers were, the people were protected. So this just gives you an idea of the power of nonviolence when projected into this particular situation. And it's really encouraging that the UN is now taking this seriously. Something new, something new that's happening since the time of Gandhi and King is learning about nonviolence. In fact, that's what the Metta Center is for. It's an incredibly uplifting experience. We talked about demoralization before. There's nothing that can cure that better than learning the history, theory, and philosophy behind nonviolence. It's extremely exhilarating. And to remember that Gandhi claimed that nonviolence was actually the characterizing feature of the human being. You know, the other animals have various ways of getting out of conflict. You probably know, I don't know if you have many dog fights here on campus, but you'll often see one dog will roll over on its back and go going puppy. They may even pee sometimes to show that they're completely out of control. And they just switch the frame so the other dogs won't attack it. But for human beings to do this by choice, to risk their life the way Derek and Andres did, and that's only one of thousands of stories, this is really what makes us human. So learning about this is new, and training. I hope that what I'm about to say will make you people, let's see, I don't want you to feel competitive. I don't want you to feel jealous. Okay, how about inspired? I hope this makes you inspired. Next week at Michigan State University, a group called Metta Peace Teams is putting on a nonviolence training, and 118 people have already signed up. I mean, in the world of nonviolence, that's huge, because 118 people trained in nonviolence can make a huge difference. So on the one hand, nonviolence is expanding numerically and in its sophistication. And that's very important, because oftentimes people rush out and try what they think is nonviolence. They get it wrong, it doesn't work. They go back and say, see, that shows you that nonviolence doesn't work. A friend of mine, a colleague from Santa Cruz, once said, people try nonviolence for a week, and when it doesn't work, quote unquote, they go back to violence, which hasn't worked for 1,000 years. So being able to understand nonviolence and do it correctly is going to make a huge qualitative shift, and that people are learning this and that training is going on. Incidentally, this group that I mentioned, Metta Peace Teams, is sending trainers out to Standing Rock today. So I think they'll have a great improvement on the performance there. So let's ask ourselves, why is it that nonviolence is stuck? Despite all of these great advances, we still have things like, I don't know if you all agree with me, but I consider it a disastrous election on November 8th, and we still have so much violence going on in the world. I was just talking with a friend of mine who's very proud that his daughter just started her semester at Ohio State, only to find out a few hours later that she was in lockdown because some deranged person has crashed a car into a bunch of people. And this is the kind of life that we've created on the one hand, and on the other hand, nonviolence is so effective. One of the scholars who's now studying nonviolence has shown, and incidentally, this book is called Why Civil Resistance Works. She has shown by studying well over 200 uprisings that took place since, I don't remember exactly, I think this century. From the beginning of the 20th century to close to the end of the 20th century. They studied all the revolutions. There are about 300 of them. And they divided them into ones that were violent and ones that were nonviolent. And they discovered that the nonviolent ones were successful 56% of the time. The violent ones were successful 23% of the time. The nonviolent ones basically succeeded after about 3 years. The violent ones took 9 years. And here's something that's really surprising, but not surprising to those of us who study nonviolence. And that is that the nonviolent ones led to greater democracy, even if they, quote, failed, than the violent ones did that succeeded. You know, my son spent 6 years in Nicaragua, so I've been following what happens in that country relatively closely. And you all know that there was a very violent uprising against the Somoza dictatorship, and even the American interference couldn't keep it down. The Somoza family was driven out. So what do you have now? You have a family called Ortega, which is doing exactly the same thing that the Somoza family did. Similarly in Egypt, similarly in many, many places. But when you have a nonviolent uprising, it tends not only to succeed more and more quickly, but lead to real freedom and democracy more effectively than violent ones do. So why is it that this isn't taking over the world? It's because of our perception. It's because of our priming. It's that culture which has trained us to see violence and not to see nonviolence. And in a little bit, we're going to show you the trailer of a film which is going to attempt to redress that situation. But I think that there are basically two things that we can do to fix it. Again, as I said before, it's not going to be a quick fix, and it's not going to be very direct, it's going to be very easy. Each of us as an individual can take charge of our own priming. It matters what imagery we see. If we deliberately set out to recondition our mind so that we're not being primed by violent images or by this underlying story that says we're helpless pawns and have no control of our own destiny, that difference will spread. We were just talking about tipping points in the card. This is how the tipping point can be built up. The other thing we can do is to familiarize ourselves with the new image of the human being that's now coming up through the fields of science and which has been around for ages, which says, quote, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Let me go into that a little bit more deeply. I hope it'll just be a few minutes, and then I'd like to show you the trailer, and then we'll stop for some questions. So at the Metta Center, we developed this model for how to apply nonviolence to the given situations in our world. And it's commonly understood, I think, among nonviolent scholars that where you want to start is with personal empowerment. And the next thing you want to do is called constructive program, where you build the institutions that you want, regardless of what everybody else is doing. Whoops, sorry, let's go back in for a second. And thirdly, it doesn't seem to want to do that. Okay, I'm not going to try to point to it. The outside circle is nonviolent resistance, or satyagraha. And unfortunately, many of the movements that we see today just do it backwards. They start with nonviolent resistance, maybe eventually discover constructive program, and then get into person power. You'll also notice that in the 6 sectors which we think change has to be made, the very top sector is called new story creation. Okay, so now let's zoom in on the person power circle. We've come up with 5 suggestions which anybody can take up and which would help make us into a focus, a center for nonviolent change. The first one is the one that I just was referring to. Be very discreet about what imagery you expose yourself to. It's been shown time and time again that you may see a violent movie and think it hasn't affected you, but it has left patterns in your mind, and cumulatively, the effect can really be devastating. So just step back from all of that. There are many ways of finding out what's going on in the world, quote unquote, without even CNN. The next thing I would recommend is that you learn nonviolence, and again, the Metta Center exists for that purpose, but of course there are many others. And thirdly, we've found it's extremely helpful for people to have some way of stabilizing their mind and overcoming negative conditioning, and usually that boils down to some form of meditation or spiritual practice. Thich Nhat Hanh, who I'm sure you've heard of, once said, you may believe in nonviolence, but when you go out there and the police are coming after you, the dogs are barking, your nonviolence is going to fly out the window unless you have a meditation practice. The fourth one is a lot easier, and it'll go very well if you've done the first three, and that is to try to overcome the depersonalization of our lifestyle. Is when you have a chance to talk to somebody instead of sending them a text message, do that. I used to commute regularly from Berkeley up to the place where I now live with a friend, and we would come across the Richmond Bridge, and he would stop at the toll plaza. We were usually running a little late. That was usually my fault. And he would stop at the toll plaza and say to the person taking his money, hi, how are you? How are you doing today? When do you get off the job? And I'm sitting there fuming in the next seat saying, Bill, for God's sake, we're late. Let's get the hell out of here. But finally I realized, you know what? He's doing it right. He's using that as an opportunity for personal connection. That little thing is extremely helpful. And again, we're going to go into an exercise that'll help us through doing this. And finally, to learn the true story of human nature and use it whenever you have a chance. One exercise we won't have a chance to do with you today is to learn the new story and use it when you're challenged. If somebody says, why do you care about these people, or why are you saving the whales? You calmly say to them, well, we're all deeply interconnected. Did you know about the Grinberg-Zilberbaum experiment, you might say? Incidentally, the Grinberg-Zilberbaum experiment was very interesting. They took two people and had them meditate together in a room, and then they separated them, and they showed one person a kind of strobe, flash, 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 and you can pick up the part of the brain that's reacting to this, and guess what? Can you tell where I'm going with this? The other person who was not seeing the light, his or her brain was reacting in exactly the same way. So they then repeated the experiment in what they call a Faraday chamber, which is a lead-lined room, so no signal can get, no electromagnetic wave can get out of that room. You can try and send your friend a text message, it would not work. And guess what? It had no effect on the communication that was going on between these two people. So that is only one of many, many ways of showing that we're more deeply interconnected than we realize. Another is this new discovery called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, where they have shown that soldiers who've been in combat are much more deeply traumatized by what they have done than by what has been done to them because of that human connection. So the way I think that we can get at this culture and change it is by operating on that underlying story. And in that underlying story, the most important part of it is its image of the human being. And in its image of the human being, in turn, the most important single factor that we've learned is this human capacity for nonviolence. In Beirut last year, there was a suicide bomber, blew himself up, and there was a man named Adel Termos who was there with his 9-year-old daughter, and he spotted that there was another bomber, somebody else, his associate, planning to blow himself up. He jumped on that person and smothered him with his body, and of course died in the process. Saved his daughter, saved dozens of people, sacrificed his life. All the media accounts that I have read, which were very few, they all said he broke human nature. He did something that was against human nature. That's because we're living in this old cultural paradigm. In the new paradigm, in the new story, we would say what he did was he displayed human nature. He displayed what human beings were capable of. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, Lou, if we could get the trailer up, and you want to say a few words by way of introducing it?
Sure.
You want this?
Sure. Hello, well, it's okay. You can talk.
Okay.
So my name is Dean Squire. Chingling introduced me a little bit. I used to work in the CSU. I left about 2 years ago to get back into filmmaking and teaching. Done a little bit of teaching on campus. And for the last couple of years, Michael and I have been working on a documentary about nonviolence. And we've shot about 25 hours of material, and I cut it down to about 3.5 hours. And we're still in the post-production phase of trying to raise money for the. And we did make a trailer to help raise money, and to just show people what the film is about. And so we'd like to show you that. Now, let's see. Is there a actually, Michael, can you come up because people aren't going to be able to hear. Is there a way to connect the computer to the sound, the speakers? Is there a?
Nonviolence to me is a source of power, and the power is actually in each person.
Okay, I'm going to start
Nonviolence to me is a source of power, and the power is actually in each person.
Toward the end of the second day, I was meditating on loving your enemy. And I heard a guy come up from behind me and he says, if you don't get out of this door in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab this through your heart. And I had 2 seconds to decide, well, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there any other way I should relate to this guy?
I learned about nonviolence in the backwards way, as in I really focused on the practical use of nonviolence prior to learning the theory of nonviolence. And it started when I was working with Peace Brigades International in Indonesia.
It doesn't mean that I'm weak if I turn the other cheek. It means that I'm not just distracted by the violent nature of the other people. I look up to more deeper meaning to life.
Well, like many people, when I first heard about nonviolence and became aware of what Gandhi was doing, I said, I can't do that. There are disciplines that a person can practice that helps you deal with the strong emotions that are going to come up in a serious conflict.
So we are continually inviting people to really work with the two hands of nonviolence. The two hands of nonviolence being, on the one hand, I will not cooperate with your injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being.
Veneer theory basically says that deep down, we humans, we are nasty and selfish. And if we are civil and kind to each other, it's just a veneer. It's a thin veneer of morality. And I've always protested against that because I think it's a simplification of human nature.
I discovered that there was a cycle of maturation going on in evolution over and over. The first great leap in evolution was competition to cooperation in nucleated cells. The second leap was competition to cooperation into multicelled creatures.
Killing tends to make us mentally ill. It tends to make us sick.
Yeah, one of the big myths that's busted through our data is that nonviolent resistance takes longer to achieve results than violent insurgency. In fact, what we find is strikingly the opposite.
Humanity as a whole is becoming aware of nonviolence, and that this is a tremendous potential breakthrough.
You know, there's this famous story about Emmett Till's mother. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago area, I believe, who whistled at a white woman in the South while visiting his cousin and ended up being lynched and thrown in the river. Years later, when his actual murderers were put to trial, someone asked Emmett Till's mother, would you like them to see them get the death penalty? And she said, no. If I could, if I had a choice in this justice system, I would take their children and raise them as my own, so they would learn to love.
Not easy to do it, but this creative tension between saying no and saying yes. This is the job description of the 21st century.
The study is by two, again, it's two women, strangely enough, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, S-T-E-P-H-A-N, and the book is called Why Civil Resistance Works. There's actually now about 8 or 9 scholars that I know of who are studying nonviolence scientifically as an aspect of political science, and they're working on things like, does it help or hurt to have, and I forget the technical term, but when you have a nonviolent movement, there's also a violent flank. That's right, a violent flank. Does it hurt or help? So they're studying things like that and systematically showing that the theory of nonviolence is valid, it's accurate. Yeah. Yeah, how do you train people in nonviolence? That is a very good question. I think there are probably 3 levels of training. One is what we call role plays, where people play the role of an opponent. I used to think this is silly, this doesn't work, but then I was in one once, and I was playing the part of a protest, a sit-inner in a coffee shop, and a guy opposite me was playing the part of a, dare I say, redneck, and he was really angry, and I was really scared, and I had to deal with my fear in that situation. So that primed me, if you will, to deal with it successfully in a real situation where the person was really angry. So that's one level. Another thing that we do, there might actually end up being 4 levels if you don't mind. Another thing that we do is standard listening and speaking skills, which is partly what we're going to be doing here. You know, so when someone says to you, let's see, you know, there's this example, I'm sorry to recur to this, but the president-elect, there were pictures of him standing behind Hillary Clinton and menacing her. You know, he looked more like the Hulk than a presidential candidate. And with my rational intelligence, such as I have, I'm saying, oh, he's finished now. You know, nobody's going to vote for a person of that kidney. But actually, he was appealing to the pattern of I'm in charge now because I can control the women. And he was also focusing people's anger, which is exactly what Adolf Hitler did. You know, I've seen a picture of a big, big auditorium and a huge banner hanging on the wall. This is Germany, 1938. And it said, Meine Damen und Herren, Ihr Problem heißt Juden. Ladies and gentlemen, your problem is the Jews. So he's inviting people to scapegoat others. So that's what the president-elect was doing and will probably continue to do. But why am I saying that here? Well, for two reasons. I forgot to say it earlier. And also because when people are talking to you, there often is an underlying message, an underlying need. And if you're sensitive to that, you can speak to that need and immediately resolve conflict. We say in nonviolent communication and elsewhere that there's a big difference between needs and wants, or needs and strategies. What people are trying to do to get what they need is putting them constantly in conflict. But the need itself is not in conflict. So a person may be cussing you out, and you can hear with your inner ear that this person needs support. He's very insecure. You speak to that directly. A friend of mine, Mel Duncan, who founded the Nonviolent Peace Force I was talking about, was walking with a friend in St. Paul one time, and they came up across this scene where somebody was viciously beating up another person. The beater was completely deranged. Nobody knew what to do. Mel ran down there and stood right in front of the guy and looked him in the eye and said, "You're a real leader, aren't you?" And then, you know, he was very puzzled. He said, "Yeah, gee, I guess I am." And the next thing you know, the fight was over and they were able to separate them and leave them away. So part of the training would be in that kind of skill. Another part would be in knowing the community that you're going into. We train people to learn the language and some of the customs. And finally, a lot of people who do this kind of work have found that the spiritual practice angle is very helpful. Okay, yeah, would you speak up, please? Uh-huh.
Part of me, my heart starts to pound. And that could be a hurtful word for some people.
Uh-huh.
But how to understand the intention of why someone's using a word.
Yeah.
Without having political correctness, how do we engage in nonviolent conversation, knowing that we have different vocabulary, different experiences, and it's one of those areas that I'm deeply concerned
Yeah.
in learning nonviolence. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So in the present case, you know me well enough to know that I'm not using this as a kind of blanket stereotyping cursing word. And I think that is the secret, to know the person well enough and to be able to avoid provocative signals. I think that's about all. Lou?
I can add something.
Yeah.
So I think that people's choice of words do matter. And I think on the expression side of communication, you know, what you choose to say, it does make sense to try to use words that you think the people you're communicating with are going to understand and are going to be able to hear. In other words, they're not going to be triggered by, so now instead of hearing what you're saying, they're off thinking something else.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's also a lot of power in listening to people. So one of the really powerful things I learned about communication is that as a communicator, I have total control over how I listen to somebody. I really don't have a lot of control over how they speak. So if I don't like the way someone's talking, I can say, "Hey, you can't talk to me that way," or, you know, I'm trying to control how other people speak is not a winning proposition. And it leads to people saying, "Hey, don't try to control me," or "You're just for political correctness," or whatever. But as a
Yeah. That is really a good question. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. I personally don't use the word justified. I'm not trying to justify stuff. I want to do things that work. And actually, you'll be happy to learn that none other than Mahatma Gandhi recognized this exception. He said, if a madman, say if somebody bursts into this room and they have a weapon and they're obviously deranged, they're going to hurt all of you. And I look, oh, someone left a 9mm here on the desk. This deliberately choosing a somewhat implausible situation. I then take that person out, quote unquote. I will have done that person a favor and I've done all of you a favor. But the conditions for really being nonviolent in such a situation are three. First, you're going to try and act without anger or fear. You say, I need to do this, I regret it, but I have to protect. Secondly, if you get injured in the process, you're not going to whine and moan and say, why did this happen to me? I was trying to be nonviolent, blah, blah. This is what happens. Now, thirdly, and most importantly, you're not going to say, this is how we protect ourselves against violence. You're going to say, how did we get into a situation where madmen are running around with weapons? I am now going to tithe 10% of my energy the rest of my life figuring out how to fix that situation. So if you do all of those three things, I would say you've acted nonviolently in that situation. Yeah, in the front row here.
I was just wondering if it's kind of random and off topic, but if either of you have ever heard of landmark education? Yeah. So, because I hear in the speaking, like they kind of talk a lot about that, just with like conflict and how you talk to people and how you take responsibility for your own reactions and that like you have no control over the other person's reactions. So, yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, so I know of landmark training. I have not taken it myself. It doesn't surprise me that it has a communication component and that it has a big component on taking responsibility for how you respond to things as opposed to blaming other people for how you respond. It doesn't surprise me.
Yes, a little bit of background.
Michael, can you please mention something about the escalation curve?
Yeah, I actually had some slides to show you, but I was running out of time. Conflicts escalate, you know, they get worse and worse, especially if you know what to measure. And dehumanization is the most accurate measurement. So we find it convenient to divide that escalation into three stages. In the first stage, you're having a dispute with somebody, but they're still listening to you. So at that stage, you do petitions, you do protests, and so forth, because you want to express your opinion to people who are going to listen to it. But there comes a point where they're not going to listen to you anymore. At that point, you're not going to just continue to pump out petitions. What you're going to do is escalate to what's called satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance. And in this phase, you're not appealing to the person's reason, you're awakening their heart. And you do that very often by self-suffering. Now in the third stage, you've tried even the self-suffering, you're trying to awaken the person, you know your nonviolent communication tools, and it still hasn't worked, but you're not going to give up on this thing. Like the people at Standing Rock are saying, we're not leaving, we don't care what you do. So I guess the best way to illustrate that is what happened with my friend David Hartsoe in the lunch counter in Virginia. This guy held this very big knife against his chest and said, get out of here or this is going through your heart. And David collected himself a little bit and looked him in the eye, which was extremely difficult because he said he'd never seen such a look of hate in his whole life. And he said to him, he's a Quaker, so he said to him, well, friend, you do what you feel you have to do, and I'm going to try to love you nonetheless. I'm going to try to love you no matter what. And the guy's hand started shaking. He dropped the knife. He walked out of the store. People said they saw him crying on the way out. So the third stage is to escalate the self-suffering aspect of satyagraha to the point where you are willing to lay down your life. It's good to know that that potential exists, that you have that power, but if you play your cards right, here's hoping none of us ever has to use it. But it's good to know that it is a powerful approach. And that's what fasting unto death is all about. That is quite correct. Where did you learn all this stuff, Stephanie? In the early stages where conflict is not very advanced, no dehumanization is not very serious, you have a lot of ways to approach it. But as time goes on, your options get smaller and smaller. But it's important that Gandhi felt that you never are without any options, never. There's always something you can do. So they challenged him and said, what if a Japanese bomber comes over your ashram and 10,000 feet up there, you don't speak Japanese, what are you going to do? He said, I will meet my death with dignity. I will overcome my own fear. Nobody can take that away from us. Okay. So we have time for maybe one more, and then we'll have our workshops. Bill? Yes. Yeah. In fact, that story is about David Hartso's mother. So, yeah. David Hartso's mother, as I say, he was a lifelong Quaker, was protesting at the gate of the Hanford nuclear plant in Washington. And it was very demoralizing because the employees would drive in, they would drive out at the end of the day, and they never even looked at these people. So they're standing there holding their signs, and they just go back and forth, ignoring them. Eventually, they gave it up as a bad cause and went their ways. 20 years later, in the city of Santa Rosa, which I'm sure you know where that is, Mrs. Hartso is checking out her groceries in a grocery store, and there comes a tap on her shoulder. And she turns around and looks at this guy. He looks at her and says, pardon me, by any chance, did you protest at the Hanford, Washington nuclear plant 25 years ago? And she said, well, yes, I did. He said, he said, I used to work there. And we were told not to look at you people. But one day, as I was driving in, I snuck a look at you, and you smiled at me, and I quit my job. So thank you, Bill. There's a lot of stories like that. And getting to understand the dynamic, how they work, how to use it, is a very, very exhilarating and inspiring challenge that we all have. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention and for those questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So we're going to, in the workshop part, what we're going to do is teach you a little bit of practical skill that will move you in this path towards nonviolence. So we wanted to try to give you something
Chingling,
practical.
if I unplug this, is it going to make a horrible noise?
What?
Never mind.
Okay, so if you need to leave, go ahead. That's fine. something that many people think they do well, and then when they learn more about listening, they realize they actually don't do it very well. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit, and we're going to practice a little bit. Now, I've got a handout down here for the information that I'm presenting, so that at the end of this, you can come to what you want. Can everybody hear me okay? Perfect. The information I'm going to present is based on nonviolent communication, which is a communication system developed by Marshall Rosenberg, who's a psychologist that grew up in Chicago area. And it's called nonviolent communication because it's based on the same kind of principles or the legacy of Gandhian nonviolence. And and I'm not going to present the whole model. I'm just going to present kind of the empathic listening portion of it, a small portion of it. So we're going to start with actually doing. And what I'd like you to do is pair up with someone. Make a pair. And maybe if you're right next to other people, you might want to move a couple of seats away so that you got a little bit of distance. Please do this quickly because we don't have a lot of time. And it might be good if you're here with someone you know, it might be good if you paired up with someone you didn't know. That would be good. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about, do a little thing about is attention, which you could call listening to yourself, because you can listen to other people, but you can also listen to yourself, which means just paying attention to what's going on inside of you. So this is really meant to have you experienced that, and also just have you experienced this thing called your attention. There's this thing called your attention that you give to various things, okay? So everyone close your eyes. Just lean back in your chair. Get comfortable. Just take a breath. Breathe normally. You don't need to breathe unusually. Just breathe normally, but notice your breath. Notice your feet against the floor. Notice your body against the seat. Notice how your body feels. Your arms and your legs. What's going on in your chest. What's going on in your stomach. Notice your breathing. You don't need to do anything special, just notice it. And now I'd like you to think about what you ate for breakfast. And now I'd like you to think about a place that holds a lot of beauty for you, that you enjoy. And now I'd like you to put your attention on someone in your life that you have a conflict with. And now shift your attention to a pleasant conversation that you had with a friend. And now shift your attention to something in the world that is of concern to you.
And now shift your attention to someone that you consider a role model for you. And now shift your attention back into your body. Notice your body. What's going on in your body? Notice your breathing. And then let your awareness just enlarge to notice the room, little noises. Anything, your awareness of the room, and then go ahead and open your eyes. Come back into the room. So there's this thing called your attention, and you have control over it if you are intentional about it. And you can put your attention on things, and what you experience inside changes depending on what you focus on. So I'm guessing that as you focused on the different things I asked you to focus on, you had different kinds of feelings inside and different thoughts. And this kind of goes to the point that Michael was making about what kind of media do you consume. Because if you put your attention on a lot of negative stories about things, then that's your life. That's what you're focused on. You're focused on negative things. You're focused on things that are failing or going wrong or that are problems, and that generally leads people to, I think you were saying the research shows it leads people to feeling bad, feeling hopeless, feeling depressed. And that isn't to say, I'm not suggesting that those things should be ignored, that problems in the world should be ignored. I'm just saying that if you're conscious about where you put your attention, you can have an impact on how you experience life. Okay? So that's internal. That's listening to yourself and having an intention about what you expose yourself to, what you give your attention to, I should say, and how much of it you do. So the second part of the exercise now is I want you to turn to the person that you're paired with. And one of you is going to be A and one of you is going to be B. So all the A's, raise your hand. Everybody? Good? Okay, we're going to start with the A's. So the A's are going to talk for 1 minute when I say go. Let me get my timer out. The A's are going to talk for a minute, and the B's are just going to give that person your full attention. Right? You have this thing called your attention. You're going to give them your full attention. And you are not going to respond to them verbally at all. Okay? No verbal responding, but you give them your full attention. Hold on a second. And A's, you talk about, for a minute, talk about something that's important to you. Okay? Something that's important to you. So would a couple of people be willing to share what that was like for them? A couple other people. Something you learned from that. Yeah.
I learned that we actually have some similar interests as far as storytelling and also providing a platform for people to express them.
Okay, so you learned you had something in common with somebody. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
And without conversation, merely conversate, but it's more like nodding yes, no. It's more like one-sided.
So you're used to having more interchange. Yeah. Okay. Someone else? Yeah, one more person? Yes.
There comes to a point where you forget that you're in an academic setting, being coerced into say natural, for a swift minute or something.
Cool. So you were able to actually shift into something real that felt real for you.
When you were talking about closing your eyes and imagining those different things, and focusing on them, you just focus on the conversation and it feels like real.
Cool. giving it your full attention. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about has to do with what you're listening for. Okay? So let's start with this. What are the things that you want most out of your relationship with other people? I'm going to make a little list. Somebody call out something. Meaning? That's no good. Meaning. What else? Love. Respect. Trust. Cooperation. Connection. What'd you say? Vision. Vision. That's like, I'm not sure what that means. Okay, I'll just say vision. Even though I don't understand it fully, it's okay. That's all right. What'd you say? Okay. Well, if it's shared, I think of it as connection. But vision, well, it's okay. It's all right. It doesn't matter. So what else? What else do you want from your relationships? Uh-huh. Effort. Okay. Let's see. Let me try to translate the effort. So is that like, I think of that as a form of consideration or mutuality? What? Okay. So I'll say mutuality. Or what did I say? Mutuality or attention? Okay. So we can't make an exhaustive list, but so these are what Marshall Rosenberg would call universal human needs. Universal human needs. So all human beings in all cultures have these same basic needs for belonging, connection, love, meaning, understanding. There are categories about this too. So people need beauty, inspiration, spirituality. Maybe we'll just call it spirit, or a connection to something larger than themselves. Belonging, I talked about that. You can think of spirituality as part of belonging. So then there are physical needs too, like we need water, we need food, and we need shelter, things like that. Those are basic physical needs. And so what Rosenberg says, and this is kind of radical, so he says everything that people do or say is an attempt to meet a need, a basic human need. And some of the things people do, though, don't actually meet needs. We're not always successful in trying to meet our needs. Often we do stuff where we kind of sabotage ourselves and we don't get needs met. Like, for instance, if I eat more than I should, I wind up getting heavy, okay? And why am I eating? Because I'm looking for some pleasure. Notice I left that off the board. And fun, play. So these are basic human needs also, to experience these things. So that's something I'm aware of, is like I will eat some food as a form of fun or for some pleasure, and I'm not really I'm ignoring my other needs to be healthy and to feel strong and have my body working properly, those kinds of things. So Michael was talking earlier in Nonviolence that making the distinction between a human need and a strategy for meeting that need. And in nonviolent communication, that's also a very clear difference, is recognizing the difference between the need that someone is expressing or the need that they are having and the strategy that they use to get that need met. So in communication, like someone might be yelling at you. Why? Why might someone yell at another person? What need might they be trying to meet? It's because they want attention. That might be it. Why else? So they're trying to create safety for themselves, like scare someone away so that they would be safe. Why else might they do it? Is it up on the board here? Understanding. So this is the one I'm thinking of. They're trying to make themselves understood, and they think that if they speak louder and more forcefully, they'll get they want to be heard, or they'll get the understanding that they want from the other person. Now, is that a good strategy? Does that usually work? Like if you talk louder or if you talk more forcefully, does the other person usually hear you more or acknowledge what it is that you're wanting to be understood for? No. So that's a really good example of how we do something to try to meet a need, to have myself be understood, and yet actually tragically, what I'm doing actually makes it more likely that I'm not going to get my need met. That's the tragedy of it. So one of the skills, the skill of empathic listening in nonviolent communication, or just empathy in general, is to listen for the feelings that the person is expressing. We haven't talked about feelings yet, but we don't have time for that. Most of you know what feelings are, right? Listening for the feelings the person is expressing and the need that they are trying to meet. Or I phrased it as what's important to them. I asked you to try to reflect back to the person, why was it important? Why were they telling you about that? And another way of saying that is what kind of need of theirs was it meeting. So if the person was telling you about something wonderful that happened to them, then the situation was meeting some kind of need of theirs, a need for acceptance, a need for acknowledgement, a need for understanding, a need for meaning. Or if they were telling you about a situation that wasn't working, that was kind of a troubled situation, then some need of theirs was not being met, like a need for respect, or a need for understanding, or to be heard, or to feel like they belong, or some other need. This is not an exhaustive list of needs. Okay, questions about this? Am I making myself clear, or is this kind of confusing? Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is think for a minute about what you talked about, both A's and B's. I want you to think for a minute, and maybe if you have a piece of paper and a pen, you could write it down. What were the feelings and needs that you think were present in the situation that you were talking about? And that you're doing this for yourself, not for the other person. So I want you to think about that, okay? And write it down. Take a minute and do that. What feelings did you have about the situation that you were talking about? And what needs do you think were either being met or not being met in that situation? So both the A's and B's are writing this down. You're thinking about it. And how are we doing on time? So we're just about there. Okay. And now what I'd like you to do is for a minute. Are people still writing? It looks like the people are still writing. Okay, take another 30 seconds and write some more. Okay, and what I was going to have you do now, I was going to have you share that with each other. but we really are out of time. So would a couple people just be willing to say something about what they realized about their feelings and needs about what they were talking about? Someone will be willing to share that?
I feel like for me, what I was talking about the first time was just like there's like fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
Like it brings me happiness.
Okay. So it makes you happy to do filming? What need do you think it meets of yours?
Well, no, it was what I want to do for a living.
Yeah.
It's more of that I think it just meets my need of like wanting to be fulfilled in what I do.
So it sounds like meaning.
Yeah.
Is that meaning?
Yes.
And you know what else maybe? Contribution. That's not on here. And people's desire to contribute is huge. Contribution is something so often this happens in relationships and in groups. People they can't find a way to contribute that's meaningful, and they want to. So they force themselves into the group, or they take over someone else's role, or they, because they want to they want to contribute. People want to do that. They want to find a way to do that. Yes, Michael. Yeah, so this handout, and I made enough copies for everybody. There's a handout here that covers what I've been talking about, and there's links to the CNVC website and to the Metta website, and my contact information is on there also. And if you're really interested in this, talk to Chingling, and I can come back and do another workshop on it. Thank you.